would like to officially welcome you to the second episode of Zooming In on Hate. It's a monthly webinar/podcast in which we're trying to bring together the brightest minds to figure out solutions to hate speech and disinformation.
So warm welcome from me to everybody. Great to see so many people from our community here today. And the idea of Zooming In on Hate is every month we're going to speak to various voices from tech, from civil society, law enforcement and policy makers to identify and to analyse the latest trends on social media.
Yes, and this webinar is part of the European Observatory of Online Hate, or EOOH in short. And today we will be focusing on the war in Ukraine specifically.
I'm Lydia El-Khoury and I'm with TextGain.
And my name is Jordi Nijnhuis and I'm the co-founder of Dare to Be Grey.
Okay, so we're really pleased to welcome two experts who are doing their utmost to make the online world a better and safer place. First up, we're going to speak to Rafal Pankowski, who is professor at the Institute of Sociology of Collegium Civitas in Warsaw in Poland. And he's also the co-founder of the Never Again Association. And Rafal is going to be speaking to us about the impact of the invasion of Ukraine on Poland. And then in the second half of Zooming In on Hate, we're going to speak to Emily Duffy, who is joining us from Dublin, and she's Director of Parable Communications. And Emily's going to speak about framing narratives in and around the war on Ukraine.
And we'll kick off this webinar with a little chat. And then afterwards, we will open the floor for any questions that you are having. You can use the chat function in Zoom to submit your questions at any time. But we would also like to give you the option to unmute yourself and ask your questions directly after our conversation. But do know that the audio will be recorded for the podcast.
Great. Okay, so Rafal, a really warm welcome to Zooming In on Hate. Thanks so much for joining us. To start the ball rolling, can you tell everybody a little bit about Never Again Association in Poland?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this conversation. The Never Again Association was founded in 1996, so it's more than 25 years now, and it is an anti-racist, anti-fascist monitoring and educational organization based in Warsaw, in Poland. Monitoring the far right, hate crime and hate speech has been at the core of our activity for many years now. But we also conduct positive educational campaigns on issues such as respect for diversity. And we are especially interested in campaigns in the field of popular culture and informal education. So that contains music and sports. So Let's Kick Racism Out of the Stadiums is one of our long-running campaigns. Another one is Music Against Racism. But over the years, for obvious reasons, we have paid more and more attention to monitoring online hate speech, monitoring and countering online hate speech, which, as we all know, is a big challenge in Poland, just as everywhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably also the reason why we're all here, why we're all listening in. And I was taking a look at your website, and I found a page called the Brown Book. Can you tell us a little bit about that Brown Book? What's the purpose of this book?
Mm-hmm. Well, the title Brown Book refers to the anti-fascist tradition, but basically it is a hate crime register that we have maintained since we started in the mid-90s. It is a collection of information, of data on hate crime cases, including the sort of most extreme hate speech cases, which are gathered by a network of correspondents and monitors all over Poland. And when we started this, the reason was nobody else was doing anything like that. So there was no data on hate crime in Poland. And I would say until now, this is the most consistent register of hate crime and extreme hate speech cases that exists in Poland and that has been used and has been referred to by different institutions and international organizations. Well, unfortunately, in the last years, months, and weeks, it is as relevant as ever, and obviously the challenges are still very big. So we are doing our best to keep up with the events and monitor and document what we can.
Rafal, sharing a considerable border with Ukraine means that Poland has been significantly affected by the invasion. Can you tell us what's happening there at the moment?
Well, as you could guess, that the war has had a very big impact on us in Poland in every way, you know, both organizational as well as personal. Of course, one of the important aspects of the situation now is the refugee movement, and that is you know, related to the humanitarian crisis resulting directly from the war. And as far as I know, this is the biggest refugee movement in Europe since World War II. So more than 2 million refugees arrived in Poland in just a couple of weeks. And I think on a positive side, there has been a lot of solidarity and sympathy from Polish society. That as a citizen of Poland, I could say I am really proud of. On a negative side, we have also noted cases of hate speech and even violent attacks against refugees, especially the non-white refugees from Ukraine. And this is something that we have been documenting and you know, monitoring very closely in those last weeks.
I think that's an interesting point, and also something that has been well spread and amplified throughout Europe. This case of anti-refugee sentiments along the border. Can you tell us a bit more about what happens and how you're documenting those cases?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me just repeat, because I think it's actually important to, you know, to stress and emphasize overall. I think the reaction from Polish society has been very positive, and actually in contrast to a lot of the anti-refugee sentiment and propaganda that we heard over the previous years in Poland, right until this year. So that has to be appreciated in a way and emphasized. But what I mentioned in terms of the hate speech and hate crime attacks against refugees, that also happened, especially in one town, one small city, which is in the border area. The name of that city is Przemyśl, where the far right and especially the local football hooligans mobilized on the 1st of March and looked for and attacked the non-white refugees from Ukraine. And Ukraine actually had a big non-white community, especially the student community, students from Asian and African countries who studied, especially in cities such as Kharkiv. So they were among the refugees, and they were the targets. They were singled out for attack by the far right. But that was, I think, it's also interesting and important to mention. Those attacks happened as a result of online hate speech and disinformation that I believe was largely orchestrated by far right groups through social media, especially Facebook and Twitter. And in some ways we can more or less directly point to specific Facebook groups and posts on Facebook and on Twitter that spread disinformation and hate speech just hours before those attacks took place on that day. Well, I'm sorry to say we reported many of those cases to the platforms, and in most of those cases, the platforms rejected our reports and did not remove that material. And I think it's one of those moments when we can actually say, well, this is yet another proof, as if we needed more proof that hate speech leads to violence. I believe this can be directly demonstrated in the case of anti-refugee violence in the town of Przemyśl on the Polish-Ukrainian border on a specific day, the 1st of March.
And Rafal, when we're talking about the online environment in Poland, what role or how do you see the Kremlin propaganda machine playing into what's happened in Poland?
Mm-hmm. Well, very soon after the Russian invasion against Ukraine, the Polish Council on radio and television announced they were blocking Russian TV channels from satellite TV in Poland. But in a way, I think that was an irrelevant move, because hardly anybody watched Russian TV in Poland on those satellite channels anyway. And I would say that this kind of propaganda does not have an audience in Poland directly. So again, those outlets such as Sputnik or Russia Today, they never had a big audience in Poland at all, unlike in some other countries, especially countries of the global south, for example, where they actually do have a significant audience, unfortunately. In Poland, no, but a lot of the talking points of this kind of propaganda gets to Polish audiences via Polish outlets which are linked to the Polish far right, and I would not underestimate their significance and their impact on the way a lot of people in Poland think about the world, including about the current war in Ukraine. And in this context, I have to mention YouTube in particular, because some of those channels on YouTube have bigger audiences than mainstream television channels. So YouTube is actually very important here, and some of those far right channels on YouTube, which are linked to the Polish far right, are very instrumental in promoting anti-refugee messages and disinformation of the sort that led to the violence in Przemyśl. But I think more generally speaking, they have a long-term agenda to promote anti-refugee sentiments as well as anti-Ukrainian sentiments. So already warning the Polish people against the supposed danger of becoming second-class citizens in their own country because of the Ukrainian refugees who are benefiting from free bus tickets or free toilets, as if the experience of being a refugee is not tragic enough. Of course, nobody comes to Poland to use a free toilet, but this is the kind of propaganda that those outlets on YouTube are spreading and promoting every day.
So it's clear that YouTube is a problem in this case. And you mentioned before that also after reporting messages on different platforms that they didn't respond or that they didn't take down the comments you flagged. Did you see any positive responses from the big social media platforms in this case, or are we on a very dark path with them?
No, I'm now thinking hard if I can say anything positive about the big platforms. Probably I could think of something, even though overall I think our experience is very mixed to say the least. But just days after the war started, together with our friends from a global project against hate and extremism, we published an appeal to the main platforms, asking or demanding them to take action against the most obvious pro-war propaganda outlets, which initially they were very reluctant to take. In the course of weeks, they, as we know, they removed some of those outlets, such as RT or Sputnik, from platforms. Well, initially in the EU, but later in other places too. I still think this is very insufficient, and even now I believe the Facebook page of Alexander Dugin is live. And Dugin is, one of the symbols and, one of the main promoters of the ideology behind the war. So I think that is still in need of attention and action. But like I said, our experience reporting specific cases of hate speech against refugees that arrived in Poland is, that's not a good experience, and I would say that the big platforms failed this test, and I'm trying to understand how that is possible. Is this the question of competence? Is this a question of will? Is it a question of resources? But it seems to me those companies do have resources if they need to, if they want to. But it's a question of will if they actually want to react in cases like that.
Thanks, Rafal. I can see a lot of participants nodding in agreement with what you're saying. And just to clarify, Never Again has trusted flagger status with most of the social media platforms. So that does make the situation even more disappointing from that perspective. So we'd like to give our audience an opportunity to ask a question. So we're just going to jump to the last question from Jordi and I, which is, if we handed you a magic wand right now, Rafal, and you could address the most urgent issue in Poland, what would you use it for?
That is a very tricky question, obviously, and well, at the risk of repeating myself, I would say the most urgent thing and one of the most important things now is to deal with the online environment in the sense that it is not contributing to the already dramatic situation offline. And I think what we really need to address is the way that the big platforms treat the problem, and I think a big part of the problem is the unequal application of the standards, because I am convinced some of the material that we have reported over the last weeks, months, and years, which was material in Polish, which was not removed. If that was in German, for example, I believe that would be taken more seriously by those platforms. So I think, depending on the country, the standards are theoretically the same, they are global, but in actual practice, there are very big differences between markets and countries and the way they are actually treated by those big platforms. So I would change that if I could. And of course, we are doing our best. We are not giving up. Like you said, we have the trusted flagger status with most of those big platforms. And I think it's also a question of what does that mean. I think that the issue of trust between civil society and those platforms requires some more work too, because I don't think we are trusted enough by those companies, even if we are actually trying to help them get rid of some vile and hateful material on their own platforms, which is something that they could be doing by themselves if they want to. But we are trying to help them, and even then, I do believe that's not taken seriously enough by those big actors.
Thanks, Rafal. I think we arrived to the point where we're going to open the floor to any other questions from the audience. I saw one in the chat already. Do you want me to read it, or do you want to?
I can ask basically. Thank you. Hello. Hi, Rafal. I would like to ask how is it with the pro-Putin sentiments? Are there actually any people in Poland who do support the Russian aggression, who express it openly, directly? How is this? Because I wrote it in the chat, in Slovakia, we do have small percentage of those people. The bigger percentage, and the good news is that the bigger percentage of population is completely against the Russian aggression, but it's only 67%. In Czech Republic is 87%, which is better. And I know Poland in general is not so friendly with Russia. So how is this?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lukasz. This is a very interesting question. Well, I was just looking at some opinion polls last night, precisely on this issue, and I think the percentage of people in Poland who actually expressed admiration for Putin, for example, that was, I think, 1%, which is probably accurate. This is probably reflecting the mood. So obviously there is very little open support for the aggression. I know of several cases, but okay, they are very rare. But what does exist is anti-Ukrainian sentiment, which is perhaps not openly pro-Russian or pro-Putin in this case, but still it exists, and those YouTube channels which I mentioned, they would not dare openly support the aggression against Ukraine, but what they are trying to do already is promote anxiety around the refugee issue, and not just the non-white refugees, but I see more and more they are turning against the Ukrainians too. So I would say in the first days they focused on the African and Asian refugees, but nowadays they are talking more and more about the supposed problems and issues around Ukrainian refugees in Poland, and the cost and any other issues they could they could think of that would create division or confusion or anxiety in Polish society. And I am worried, but well, I'm almost certain that this is going to grow in the next weeks and months, because I think even if some of those refugees move to other countries, or even if the war is over and some of them will go back to Ukraine, of course, there will be a substantial community of Ukrainians in Poland anyway. And even before the war, it was maybe 1 million people already. And I think what the far right is trying to do, and they will exploit this even more, is to exploit the sort of distrust that at least some Polish people may have vis-a-vis Ukrainian migrants and refugees now.
Thanks, Rafal. Any more questions from the audience? I can see, Iglika, you made a couple of comments. Do you want to say something?
I don't think that I could contribute, only to express my support and agreement with many of the conclusions that were made, and to say that many of the observations, many of the specific aspects of the reaction society of platforms, the problem with moderation and the extent to which there are enough competent moderators that are filtering the content and reacting to reports, and the different levels to which, for example, the code of conduct of the European Union on hate speech is implemented with very large amplitude of the level of success or the level of implementation of this code in different languages. This is very relevant. I have my personal pains after yesterday's peaceful gathering in support of Ukraine, that gathered more than 50,000 people, and national media in Bulgaria, you know, our problem with media freedom. We are in 112th place in Reporters Without Borders. So for national media, the number of people was hundreds of people, and they are more than 15,000, and many other aspects. So my question, in fact, would be, how is positioned national media in Poland regarding problems like both-siderism, whataboutism, and all these aspects that are making it easier for hate speech, for violence and aggression to bloom?
Well, thank you so much. Well, I agree with you completely. A lot of the problems are common problems, and especially in our region, which we can call Central and Eastern Europe. I think we definitely face some very similar challenges. When it comes to the issue of of the big media in Poland, we really have two types, which are very different from each other. So we have independent media still, which is important, and they are often high level, high quality media. I would say, both printed and electronic media. And I think it's very important to cherish that, because we also know that we have experienced some political pressure on the major media and the independence of Polish media in general. On the other hand, we have the state-controlled media, which I'm afraid in the last years turned into a propaganda machine, which is, well, basically one of the main perpetrators of hate speech itself, against Muslims, against gay people, against Jews, and other minorities. I could give you countless examples of awful content on Polish state-controlled media in the last years. And well, to tell you the truth, sometimes when I try to explain it to my British friends, they say, "Oh yes, we understand, because well, BBC got a lot worse in the last years too." And to me, that actually means they are not able to understand what I try to convey, because I'm not talking about worsening standards within an organization that's basically devoted to reporting in a balanced way. The Polish state media serves the ruling party as a kind of party political broadcast, 24 hours a day, in a very crude way. And I think that, this is something that's probably not really noted outside of Poland, or not noted sufficiently, but it is one of the big problems we face, also from the perspective of civil society. And I can speak from my own experience as the subject of many minutes of hateful attacks on Polish state television in the last years. I believe one country where it might be similar is Hungary.
Rafal, thanks so much. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us today. So we'll jump quickly over to our second guest on Zooming In on Hate today, which is Emily Duffy, joining us from Dublin. And Emily is the Director of Parable Communications.
Yeah, great to have you joining us here in Zooming In on Hate, Emily. And we've invited you today to speak a bit about framing narratives, and particularly in times of conflict. So just to get us started, can you tell us how frames work and why are they important?
Absolutely. So frames basically are how we understand the world. They're massively important. They think by the time we're 3 or 4, we've internalized something like 300 or 400 frames. By the time we're 10, we have over 10,000. And basically what it means is that, like, say, if I was to ask you, do you want to go to a restaurant? You understand the frame of restaurant. You understand that there are people sitting, that you're going to be sitting down, there'll be a menu, all that sort of stuff. And so you don't have to learn what a restaurant is every single time I introduce the idea of a frame of restaurant or things like that. The same with the frame of war, the frame of borders, all of those kind of things. We understand them implicitly, and things that exist within those frames is what comes to mind when you invoke that frame, basically. And my kind of whole thing is that what we should be very careful with the frames that we invoke in people, especially in times of war, because frames lead to metaphors lead to values, and that ultimately shapes how people react to certain issues or how people understand certain issues. And so, yeah, so when this kind of kicked off, there was a lot of stuff that I saw. I was like, this, we need to actually continue to pull people back into frames of solidarity and care, rather than focusing overly on violence and war. So yeah, that's why frames are important. They basically frame how we see the world. But it's how we understand and process things.
And Emily, can you tell us how frames change in times of war specifically?
Yes. Yeah,
we mean the war on Ukraine, obviously.
Yeah. So I think what can often happen, two things happen in times of war. One is that we're pulled much more towards security value set. So we all have a universal set of values within us. Some of us value different things because of our upbringing, because of our culture, because of things like that. But ultimately we all respond quite similarly when we feel under threat, or when massive changes are taking place in our world. And that can pull us towards security, or it can pull us towards solidarity and care. And the types of messages that you receive during times of war are what is going to help you pull in one direction or the other. So say, for example, I know in Ireland, there's been a lot of pro-military, pro-war frames in the media led by our leaders, talking about Ireland is a neutral country, which means we're not militarily aligned, but there's been an increasing amount of talk about defence spending, about a European army, and about Ireland's neutrality into the future. And that people are much more likely to engage in those frames around security. And so I think that's what happens. And I think that all of us are capable of reacting out of fear, of speaking out of fear, rather than continuing to reinforce the values of what we stand for and the frames of what we stand for, which is an open and welcoming Europe at peace. And that is what we should be working towards, and isolating Putin and his regime for what it is.
So can you maybe give us an insight into the frames you've encountered, or the problematic frames you've encountered about the war on Ukraine? Yeah,
so one that I have pulled out a lot, and I know has been spoken a lot about already here by Rafal, is the idea of this kind of container frame or this container metaphor of like why Ukrainian people fleeing Ukraine or white people fleeing Ukraine are different and should be welcomed more so than Black people fleeing Ukraine, or even, you know, Middle Eastern people on the Belarusian-Polish border. And the reason that happens is because we basically, one of the kind of key metaphors that we use for understanding life, there's a book by George Lakoff called Metaphors We Live By, and it's basically, we learn these things when we're like 3 and 4. And one that is incredibly powerful is the container frame. So like your body is a container, your home is a container, your race is a container, your religion is a container. And what has happened is that container frame has been evoked again and again by leaders across Europe, by politicians across Europe, by journalists across Europe. You know, we've seen people talk about like, they look just like us. They're our neighbors, so it's natural that we would respond differently to somebody from Ukraine rather than somebody from somewhere else. And like, even, you know, like Leo Varadkar, our leader, was on the television this week saying like it's only natural, you know, they're in our neighborhood, because Ireland now has a 2-tier system for processing refugees, one for white refugees and one for refugees of color, which is, you know, like that. And that was his reaction. It's only natural, they're in this container, they're in our container. And I think that is obviously reinforces white supremacy and is very, very problematic. However, I caution against the language of Ukrainians are our neighbors or things like that. I think that we have to be more universalist in our language and talking about everybody who's fleeing war, everybody who needs refuge, everybody who needs welcome. And I think that there actually is an opportunity, and actually we had a question for Rafal around, like, has there been a shift in Poland in this? I think that there might be an opportunity here, that now that people are in a kind of welcoming value set, that people are seeing and demonstrating solidarity across Europe, and we can see it, is there now an opportunity for us to take a blow at Fortress Europe and to build on those values within people, that actually we can show that ordinary everyday people are well ahead of their governments and their leaders when it comes to welcoming people. Most people actually are welcoming and in solidarity. And I think that's what we want to reinforce again and again and again, not the container stuff, not the who's in, who's out, you know.
Thanks, Emily. And I'm kind of building on what Iglika mentioned earlier. So what about isms? How can we navigate those when we see them online? When sometimes there's a tiny thread of logic to what's being said. And I'm thinking specifically about the example of when you see somebody criticize Russian propaganda, the whataboutism is what about NATO propaganda? Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, it's all about leading with values, and bringing people back to their values. So like, why are you, you know, like, I think there's maybe 2 types of people who engage in that. And I think that there's one that is like genuinely concerned about white supremacy and how Western conflicts get framed a certain way and non-Western conflicts get framed a certain way. And ultimately, you know, who's left to suffer? You know, it's us, it's the ordinary people who aren't at the top. And I think that that's a good instinct. I think that those people have a good instinct, and I think they are conversations that we should have. However, what I think there's another type that maybe their value set is actually more in the kind of like success, power and achievement. Like they want to know more than other people, or they want to be seen as really intelligent on geopolitical goings-ons, and they know more than everybody else and all that sort of stuff. And I think we should engage with the people whose values are coming from the right place of like, look, we have to stand up to hypocrisy, and we have to talk about all wars and all warmongers and everybody who drops bombs. But I also think that like what the best thing to do in this scenario is like, look, like there's a universal value of truth, right? So if they're saying, what about NATO propaganda? What about Russian propaganda? Also, we bring them back to the value, how we value truth, and that truth should be valued. And there are hundreds of thousands of people fleeing Ukraine across Europe right now who have their truth to tell. And I think that that's where we shine the light, is that we shine the light on those people, and we do our utmost to give them a voice in this, and especially Black and Asian people leaving Ukraine, especially other people who are in other migrant crises across the world, And we give, and that's the kind of the truth, where we shine the torch on truth as much as possible, and bring people back to those value systems. But I think it is, and also like letting them know that they're whilst some of their questions make sense, there is also a deliberate attempt by Putin's regime to get people to share content in the West. Like that's also happening. And that, like, I remember I was talking to one of my family members about this, and I was like, you need to be humble enough to understand that you too can be manipulated. Like, while you're saying that you think that the masses are manipulated, you can be manipulated as well. We're all vulnerable to this type of manipulation, and we have to follow the truth. And the best truth comes from the people who have lived experiences, and we have to listen to them. So that's how I would approach it. But it's not a perfect art. It's not a perfect science, believe me. You know.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
And I think this is a very interesting point, because I feel like everyone in this room, and probably also the people who are listening to this podcast, they want to do something constructive, especially online. They want to make the difference. They want to reframe discussions and conversations online. So does that always work, or is it sometimes best to leave it where it is, to leave those people alone?
Yeah, and it's a judgment call, right? And I mean, like, we've all been that person at 2 o'clock in the morning in an internet fight where we're like, maybe I should put the phone down. And I think like I say, like, there's like, in a lot of, like, when we do stuff like message testing, what we find, and we code people by their values and by their belief systems, what we find in most samples, about 60% of people are persuadable in that they believe kind of competing things at the same time. And then there's a chunk that you just shouldn't waste your time with. Like, they are opposition, they are committed to spreading hate, you know, they have fascist ideologies, and there's not really much point engaging with those people, because essentially what's happening is that when you engage with them, you're legitimizing their argument and you're legitimizing their point of view. However, I think it's important to know that there is a distinction, that there are the people who get sucked in by them and who maybe share their content unwittingly, unknowingly. And what we don't want to do is further alienate those people and push them into the arms of the fascists, because the fascists will tell them that they're geniuses and that they can see things as they really are and all this kind of stuff. So again, I know I sound like a broken record. You reinforce the value systems that exists within that person. Like, look, I know that you're a kind and welcoming person, and as kind and welcoming people, we do this. And think, or I know that you're an intelligent person who asks decent questions. So maybe I just wonder what the source of this information is from, because I know that, like, there's manipulation going on. We should all be kind of looking out for it. So that is what I would say, is that, like, trying to understand that, like, and especially people in your immediate circle. I always say this, like, bring it home. Like, it's not just about these strangers on the internet. It's about your mother and father, your uncles and brothers and cousins and friends, and those people. If we can speak to those people, we have so much more power to change those people's minds, because we are already connected to them, rather than some stranger on the internet or an NGO or a politician. So that's what I would say. I think that the organized people who spread hate speech and fascists, I think that our job is to get the social media platforms to remove them. I think that they shouldn't have a platform, and that we shouldn't engage with them at all, to be honest.
Nice and simple and clear. Thanks a million, Emily. There's no point in beating around the bush. So could I ask you about the hashtag cancel Russian culture? You know, there's a movement, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
I actually hadn't heard of it, and when you sent it over to me, I was looking into it, and like, I'm not in Ukraine right now. I'm not dealing with the really blunt side of Putin's aggression, and so I feel a little bit like I just don't know if I want to speak on that, or speak for people in Ukraine who are organizing around this. I think that it kind of, like, I was speaking a little bit about the nation container earlier, or the idea of containers, Russia as a container, Ukraine as a container, Poland as a container, Ireland as a container. I think we want to pull away from the idea of ethnic containers or nation containers. Because at the end of the day, there are Russians who are part of Russian culture resisting so bravely, putting their lives on the line and livelihoods completely on the line to resist authoritarianism. And I think that is the thing that we should talk about first, is that is, you know, I think Pussy Riot are just as much Russian culture as Tchaikovsky, you know, like we cannot we cannot equate this war with Russia or Russian people. It's Putin's war. Like, it is 100% him and his regime's war of authoritarianism. So I think that that's the first thing that I would say. However, I think cutting Putin off from money and power is a good thing. And I think that there are arguments to be made about how we build power internationally to do that. Sports and arts maybe will need to be part of that. I don't know. I'm not an expert on these things. I don't know if cancelling is the right frame for that, or cancelling Russian culture is the right frame from that. Like, because as I say, like, Russia is an incredibly multi-ethnic, diverse country with many cultures, many political persuasions, and as I say, many brave people fighting against authoritarianism. And so I think as much as we can, we should also try to shine a light on that as well, because it also gives people a way to understand themselves in Russia as being other than Putin, and an understanding that we see that too, that we see that there are ordinary human beings in Russia trying to live their lives and do the right thing. But as I say, in terms of strategic power plays, I don't know, maybe the right now pulling things and right now drawing a line, maybe that is the right thing to do or not. But I think it shouldn't be framed about cancelling Russians or cancelling Russian culture. I think it should be framed about that we have to do this right now to get to Putin, and that getting to Putin is going to make everybody more free. But like I say, I'm not in Ukraine, I'm not in Russia, so take all of that with a massive pinch of salt.
Fair enough. Thank you, Emily. Before we hand back to the people in the room here, let me ask one final question. You also get a magic wand. How would you fix the whole situation we discussed today?
Oh, I think I would get rid of all empires. That's what I would do. I think, I would think that I would try and get people to understand that there is so much more that unites us as ordinary people who do not have massive amounts of international geopolitical power than there is that divides us. And that we would step out of our nation frames, we would step out of our container frames and understand that a peaceful and welcoming world is possible. But there are people to blame, and it's not each other, it's those at the top, I think. But yeah, I think if I had a magic wand, I would wave that, and we would stop making weapons, stop building bombs, stop doing all of those things, and refuse to do them, and understand our own power as individuals and as communities to say no. I'm not going to help you wage your war.
Thanks a million, Emily. So I'd love to hand it over to you, to our audience. I can see some in the chat. Anybody who put a question in the chat, would you like to just unmute? And I can see Javier, would you like to ask your question yourself? I can see you've popped one in the chat there. Sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot. I can read it out.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Sorry, I was eating at the same time, but listening to all the exchanges.
It is lunchtime.
Very interesting. Thanks a lot for these interventions. No, that was more a remark than a question. I think often we tend not to, think about the silent majority. That is a bit, in a spot where we don't see them, but I think we are in this situation because for years and years there's been propaganda which was a bit subdued, like it wasn't very visible, but it was in the comment section, it was on the internet, it was, disinformation, and it's been mostly unchallenged, I think, because we didn't have time, because we had better things to do, because we were, busy, and now it's ingrained. I would say in France, for example, there's a lot of people who are contrarian, who are opposing, and who are not supporting Russia, but kind of, against the response to Russia. So I think we need to think about the silent majority and to fight back in comment sections everywhere. Everywhere we see this propaganda, it is important to say something and to inspire people to say something about that. So it's really a long-term fight. It's difficult, but we have really to do this, to continue to do this.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that's it as well around it, this becoming part of our everyday and how we communicate about things with people that are in our lives, because I think that idea of we're too busy to engage online, or that this kind of silent majority is growing, like that silent majority exists within our own communities, within our own families, and the more that we can pull people back to the values that they, that they aspire to, the more likely we are to move them away from that kind of thinking.
Thanks, Javier, for the question. Thanks, Emily, too. And Javier, we know you're not just talking about this, you're doing great work with Je suis là in countering hate. So great to hear your perspective. Patrick, I see your hands raised. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you, Emily, for this value approach to this issue, because I believe it might be very helpful for all of us in our work to address some issues that arise in the context of war in Ukraine. Javier said that there are many thoughts that are not spoken, but I believe that there are also many questions that are expressed openly, but they are not answered. And this is something that I see as a huge risk in Poland right now, because there are many questions as those that were mentioned already, like what about Ukraine, what about NATO's propaganda, right? And these are questions that are raised quite often, unexpectedly often, during our workshops that we run on disinformation. And I think that the government in Poland, but also public institutions, don't really do well regarding answering those questions that eventually will bring us to some difficult issues, some tensions that will make the whole situation even harder to tackle, I believe. And that's maybe like a parallel that we see in our organization to the very beginnings of the pandemic. There were also many questions in the beginning of pandemic back then. Obviously, we didn't have much knowledge about the coronavirus itself, but there were some questions that could have been answered and they were not. And that brought us to the situation when there were many people that didn't trust to the public figures, to public institutions. And I'm really afraid that this is the situation that is going to happen again in Poland in the context of the war. So I would also put in mind that it's not only about those who are not expressing themselves, but also about those who ask questions, but they are just stay not answered.
Yeah, and they will get answered by the far right, and
exactly, but by those who have their own agenda.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly, and I think what's important as well as like a civil society or progressive, anti-fascist, whatever we want to call ourselves, I think it's really important that we don't find ourselves in the position of defending political leadership or governments for them. I think it's really important that we don't dismiss people's real questions about the accountability of the people who make decisions in NATO, the people who make decisions about going to war. I think that is really important. And I think that like when people have questions about like, well, hold on a second, there's, the US has dropped plenty of bombs and, what happened then and, all that. I think it's important for us to show up and talk about that as well, but in the context of values, in the context of right now, people are packing up their whole lives and trying to find safety. And that's right now what our concern is. And all of us deserve to live in safety. All of us deserve to live safe, free from war. All of us, deserve a voice about the decisions that affect our lives. And let's work together to achieve that, rather than, being against NATO is Russian propaganda, you're feeding into Russian propaganda. I think that's the difference.
Yeah, but at the same time, taking into consideration that the safety and security issues are also issues of those who are hosting or welcoming, right? Not only those who are coming. And I think that's the area that's not addressed in Poland yet. And hopefully it will be soon, but I'm afraid it will not.
Yeah. And I think that's it. And like creating, I think this idea of, I always talk about this idea of the bigger we, like the big we, it's like, so it's not necessarily, you know, it's not necessarily Polish and Ukrainians or versus each other in competition for supports and services, but rather we as, you know, communities, we as caring people, we as the ordinary people, whatever you want to kind of call it, need to work together to make sure that we have a peaceful society where everybody has what they need. And that's kind of the framing that I tend to say, to pull people into that when people are going to those security frames out of fear and things like that, is that we do continue to bring people back to their values. You know?
Great, thanks a million, Emily. Any other questions from the floor? We've kind of come to the end of our second Zooming In on Hate. Javier says he agrees, they're very powerful arguments. So if I don't see any hands raised, so let's wrap up our second episode. Emily Duffy, Rafal Pankowski, thanks a million for joining us on our second Zooming In on Hate. And we'll be zooming in on the Baltics, Ukraine, and other areas affected over the coming weeks in podcasts or in the next Zooming In on Hate. So please do join us.
Yeah, make sure to subscribe to our mailing list at www.eooh.eu. And you will be updated on the next episodes, the next webinars. You can also join the conversations on Twitter and LinkedIn. And I hope to see you again next time.
Great. And just one very genuine, sincere thanks to the European Commission Rights, Equality and Citizenship Programme at DG Justice, who have helped us implement this project. So thank you. Thanks everybody for joining us, and hope to see you again soon. Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Rafal.
Guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.